Hi, I'm Haley. Welcome to my channel if you're new. Welcome back if you've been here before. Sorry, I'm still working on my intro. So I'm very excited because today I have decided that I'm going to start reading Harry Potter on my channel. It's one of my favorite series. I've only read through the series one time, but I have been meaning to reread it, and I feel like this is a perfect opportunity to do so. Um, I've read all the books. I've seen all the movies. All the movies I've watched tons of times, and unfortunately, I've only read through all the books one time. But I'm definitely planning on doing even more rereadings for the series since I enjoy it so much, and I haven't been in this world for a while. And I thought I'd share my love of Harry Potter with all of you. So, if you haven't read Harry Potter, then, well, then that's alright, because then you can experience it for the first time with me, and I will be reading all 7 books on here, so you'll get to experience the whole series with me for the first time. We will be reading through these books chapter by chapter, book by book, breaking it down, doing some discussions here and there, because there's tons of discussions we could have on Harry Potter. Even long after we finish reading the series on here, there's still tons of discussion. We could keep the discussion going, definitely. Sorry, that was a terrible way for me to... Let me readjust this. That was a terrible way for me to clear my throat. Okay. We, of course, are starting with Harry Potter, Book 1, Year 1, which is called Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Now, for those of you in the UK, and I think in other places, but I'm not entirely certain on that, you'd have to let me know in the comments. But definitely the original title is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. I don't know if it was only here in the US that it was titled Sorcerer's Stone, but you can definitely tell I have a US version since my copy says Sorcerer's Stone. So for I don't know what I was trying to say, but let's get into it. Let's see what this is about. Of course, like, this will be for all kinds of readers of this will be for all... Oh gosh. This is for everyone, pretty much is what I'm trying to say. This is for both returning readers and new readers alike. I just thought I'd share my love of Harry Potter with everyone. So let's see here. Let's get to chapter 1. Alright, let us begin with chapter 1. This chapter is called The Boy Who Lived. Oh gosh. I'm so excited to get back into this. Sorry. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. Whoa. Now that would definitely be some indirect characterization right there. Well, actually, in that wait, we're not done with the paragraph yet. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. And in that paragraph, I believe we got both direct characterization of Mr. Dursley and indirect characterization. No, we had both direct characterization and indirect No. Oh, actually, I guess that could be a little bit of indirect characterization of Mrs. Dursley. I guess it shows that she can be nosy, trying to get into other people's business maybe. Alright, so let's pause. We got 3 characters introduced now, right off the bat, in just 2 paragraphs. We have Mr. Dursley, Mrs. Dursley, and they are a couple. They have a son named Dudley. And so right now we're just getting introduced to this couple with this son, and they don't like anything strange or mysterious. I wonder why. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. Oh, wonder what that secret is. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son, too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. So it looks like Mrs. Dursley has a sister that she doesn't want to associate with. I wonder why. So what do you think that says about the Dursleys, and what would the word un-Dursleyish mean? Would that mean that they don't want to be involved with the Potters because they're not normal enough for them? It seems like they definitely have something against the Potters, but we don't know what it is. What do you think it could be? When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull, gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled the screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large, tawny owl flutter past the window. I wonder what that means. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove toward town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. Now, let's pause for a second. What do you think about the cat? Do you think it's normal? We know that Mr. Dursley finds this cat's behavior very peculiar. Do you think the cat's behavior is very peculiar? Do you think the cat is actually reading the sign and the maps? And if so, why do you think the cat is reading the sign and the maps? And wow, we could go on and on with this. What significance do you think the cat could hold? Do you think, more importantly, do you think Mr. Dursley is just imagining things? Is this cat even real? Alright. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups he saw in young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in the Grunnings parking lot, his mind back on drills. So, another pause. Who do you think these people are there are these strange people, both young and old, it seems like. Uh, well, actually, the people Mr. Dursley is saying, I'm not sure if they're both young and old, or if they're all older. But there's these strange people as he's driving around. He's noticing all these people are wearing cloaks, and they're whispering about something, and they're excited. What do you think is happening? Are they celebrating something? Well, I guess they are, since they're excited. What do you think they're celebrating? This is exciting. Oh, goodness. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Ooh, why do you think there's so many owls out and about in broad daylight? Most of them had never seen an owl, even at night time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal, owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people, he made several important telephone calls, and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. Now, what do you think that says about Mr. Dursley? That he was in a very good mood after having yelled at a few different people. That's very interesting. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large doughnut in a bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. "The Potters, that's right, that's what I heard. Yes, their son Harry." Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers, as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking. No, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his name was called Harry. He wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey, or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her, if he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. "Sorry," he grunted, as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Now, who in the world do you think you know who is? Of course, to all of you readers who have read Harry Potter before, no spoilers for those who haven't. So those people that Mr. Dursley overheard talking about a name Harry and Potters, do you think that it really was the Potters and the Harry that the Dursleys knew, or do you think it was just a coincidence? And for this old man that this tiny old man he accidentally bumped into, he was happy. He wasn't even at all frustrated that he was knocked down at all. He wasn't upset about it. He was in a very good mood. What do you think? Why do you think he's in a good mood? What do you think is happening? Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been a muggle, whatever that was. Oh, what do you think a muggle is? He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. Ooh, what do you think that says about him? That he doesn't approve of imagination, that he doesn't like to imagine things. Now that would definitely be some form of some form of characterization, but I can't tell if it's direct characterization or indirect characterization. But since the author told us that he didn't approve of imagination, I feel like it is direct characterization. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. Ooh. So we now see that the cat has returned. Do you think the cat is important? If you didn't think the cat was important before, do you think it's important now? And if you did think the cat was important before, do you still think the cat is important? And why do you think the cat's important? Why is this cat hanging around his house all day? The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had learned a new word, won't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newscaster allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious. And now, over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers are far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, Dundee. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of the rain I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight. Oh, so, that little bit about Mrs. Dursley, I believe that's a bit of some indirect characterization. It does seem to show that she's a very gossipy person. She likes to know what's going on in other people's lives. And I have never been to the UK, unfortunately. Hope to one day, but I have no idea how far apart Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee are from each other. So if you know those areas very well, please let us all know in the comments. Because I would love to know, like, how far that news had reached the people that they're talking about. The people, I don't know how to say this, but I just like to know how far away each of those are to see how many people saw the shooting stars. And what do you think these shooting stars are about? What do you think? If they are fireworks, what do you think? Wait, are they fireworks? Do you think people are celebrating? What are they celebrating? Do you think these shooting stars have anything to do with the strange people in the cloaks that Mr. Dursley had seen all day? We will find out. Hopefully. Let's see. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain? Correcting myself from earlier. I've never been to Britain before. I don't know if UK and Britain are the same thing, so just in case, I wanted to correct myself from earlier, and I apologize if the UK and Britain are totally different things. In fact, now that I think about it, they probably are in different parts of the place that they're different. So I just wanted to apologize for my remark earlier because I could have been wrong. Please, and of course, if I ever say anything wrong or use anything any term in the wrong way, please let me know in the comments. Please correct me, so that way I know what's the right terms for stuff and what's the wrong terms for stuff. Owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in town today. So, snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Oh, what do you think her crowd means? What do you think the kind of crowd her sister and the Potters hang around with? Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually as he could, "Their son. He'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. "What's his name again? Howard, isn't it?" "Harry. Nasty, common name, if you ask me." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. "Yes, I quite agree." Now, I think we're getting a lot of indirect characterization here from Mrs. Dursley. You can definitely tell by the way she's acting. By the way she's acting, around Mr. Dursley whenever he mentions the Potters or her sister or Harry or any of those people. She just stiffens up. She just gets really mad. You can tell that she just does not like them. He didn't say another word on the subject. "Oh, why do you think it is that Mrs. Dursley does not like her sister so much? What do you think? If there was something that happened, what do you think happened?" He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it were waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. But what do you think that means? Their kind. What do you think he means by that? He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed on the next street, nor when two owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. Now, it's been 30 minutes, and I'm trying to condense the amount of time I spend on one video, because I don't want my videos to be too long. So I'm going to pause right there, and I will finish this chapter in the next video. See you then.